We often look at the person motionless on the sofa, surrounded by a graveyard of half-finished sketches and unlaunched ideas, and label them with a single dismissive word, lazy. In a world that equates human value with visible output, the absence of action is viewed as a moral failing or a fundamental lack of character. We are taught that ambition is a relentless engine, a constant state of forward motion fueled by an iron will. But if we pull back the curtain on the human psyche, we find a much more complex and tragic reality for a vast number of high achievers. The paralyzing stillness we call laziness is not the absence of ambition, but the direct suffocating weight of it. The couch is not a place of rest for the visionary, it is a fortress where the mind retreats to survive the crushing expectations it has placed upon itself. This stillness is often a sophisticated defense mechanism, a shield against the perceived catastrophe of being merely ordinary. To truly understand why the most driven individuals are often the ones most prone to total inertia, we must explore 6 invisible psychological anchors that turn grand dreams into heavy chains. The first of these anchors is the paradox of maladaptive perfectionism, a state where the brain refuses to distinguish between a minor mistake and a total identity collapse when an ambitious person approaches a task. They aren't just looking for a result, they are looking for a masterpiece that validates their existence. This triggers a heightened response in the amygdala, the brain's emotional processing center, which begins to treat the possibility of a mediocre outcome as a literal threat to survival to avoid this internal trauma. The mind initiates a freeze response. You are not avoiding the work, you are avoiding the emotional devastation of realizing your reach might exceed your grasp. It is a protective shutdown, a way for the brain to keep the perfect version of the project safe within the imagination, rather than risking its flaws in the real world. Following this is a second, more hidden factor known as executive function fatigue. High ambition usually involves an expansive internal map, where every detail of the future is interconnected, while a person with modest goals might see one simple step. The ambitious mind sees the entire staircase, the mountain it rests upon, and the storm clouds gathering at the peak. This constant mental simulation requires an enormous amount of cognitive energy before a single physical movement is made. The prefrontal cortex, the CEO of the brain, is already exhausted by the sheer scale of the planning and the calculation of endless variables. This leads to a state of decision paralysis where the perfect starting point becomes impossible to find. We remain still. Not because we lack desire, but because we are lost in a map of our own making, unable to navigate the complexity of our own brilliance. A third and often overlooked mechanism is the subconscious rebellion against the inner dictator. Ambitious individuals often treat themselves with a level of severity that borders on cruelty, setting rigid schedules and demanding impossible standards. Eventually, a deeper part of the psyche, one focused on autonomy and self-preservation, begins to push back procrastination. In this context, becomes a form of silent protest by refusing to work. The individual is subconsciously reclaiming their freedom from their own tyrannical expectations. It is a way of saying no to a life that has become nothing but a series of high-stakes demands. This is not a lack of discipline, but a desperate attempt by the soul to find a moment of peace away from the relentless pressure of becoming. It is a profound and silent burden to carry a vivid vision of who you could be while standing in the stark, messy reality of who you currently are. How many times have we judged ourselves for the gap between our potential and our performance, unaware that the gap itself is what causes the paralysis? This silence we inhabit is rarely empty. It is crowded with the deafening noise of our own possibilities, a noise so loud it makes focused action feel impossible. We find ourselves trapped in a cycle of shame where every hour of inactivity adds to a debt of guilt that feels too large to ever repay. Yet we must realize that this stillness is often a sign of how deeply we care. We are not indifferent. We are overwhelmed by the intensity of our own devotion to a dream that feels too precious to risk on a flawed first attempt. As we dive deeper, we encounter the fourth anchor, the strategic retreat of the unplayed hand, or what psychologists call self-handicapping. For the highly ambitious, their identity is frequently anchored to their perceived potential. If they were to try their absolute hardest and still fall short, they would have to face the terrifying possibility that they are not as capable as they believed. However, by succumbing to laziness, they create a convenient excuse if they fail. It wasn't because they weren't good enough. It was simply because they didn't really try. Laziness becomes a sanctuary where the fantasy of greatness can live on untested and therefore unbroken by the cold reality of the arena. It is the ego's way of staying a genius in its own mind by refusing to ever step onto the field. A fifth factor involves the neurological trap of the imaginary reward. The human brain is surprisingly poor at distinguishing between a vivid visualization of success and the actual achievement of it. When we spend hours obsessing over the details of our future glory, the brain releases a surge of dopamine, as if the goal has already been reached. This creates a physiological reward for the thought alone, leaving very little chemical incentive for the actual grueling labor required to manifest that dream. We become addicted to the shadow of achievement while the substance remains untouched, leaving us feeling strangely satisfied yet physically incapable of starting. Finally, we must consider the fear of effective forecasting, or the underlying suspicion that even if we reach the summit, it won't feel the way we imagined. Many ambitious people subconsciously procrastinate because they fear that the successful completion of their goal will reveal an inner emptiness that achievement cannot fill. By staying in a state of unrealized potential, they keep the hope of future happiness alive. Ultimately, the phenomenon of the lazy high achiever reveals that the human mind is not a simple machine, but a complex landscape of fears and intricate survival strategies. Ambition is a fire that can either illuminate a path or burn the house down from the inside. What we dismiss as a lack of drive is often the cooling ash of a mind trying to protect itself from its own heat. True growth begins not with more willpower, but with the compassion to be ordinary and the courage to take a single flawed and stumbling step. We find our way forward only when we stop punishing ourselves for our stillness and begin to understand the profound weight of the dreams that have kept us pinned to the floor.